When done right, traditional buildings are durable, adaptable, and last for centuries. They take little from the earth, create few toxic chemicals, and produce little or no waste. Traditional urbanism and architecture represent a culture of conservation of the earth's resources. And Boston, a city that was built over time since the 1600s, is an exemplar of just that kind of investment. Sprawl and the urge to replace rather than reuse buildings takes a social and environmental toll that increasingly we are no longer willing to promote or even tolerate. In fact, in a sweeping and epic move, Boston has dismantled the elevated highway that sliced through the city starting in 1959 and divided the city's fabric in what had previously been a whole, and now the city has begun to restitch the city's core to its edges. In his recent encyclical, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, Pope Francis writes, quote, "Given the interrelationship between living space and human behavior, those who design buildings, neighborhoods, public spaces, and cities ought to draw on the various disciplines which help us to understand people's thought processes, symbolic language, and ways of acting. It is not enough to seek the beauty of design. More precious still is the service we offer to another kind of beauty, people's quality of life, their adaptation to the environment. Here too we see how important it is that urban planning always takes into consideration the views of those who will live in those areas," end quote. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis calls on us to be better stewards of God's creation, and his definition of stewardship fuses a concern for the environment with a concern for the well-being of all of our brothers and sisters. Health, justice, and well-being are inextricably linked in this vision of stewardship. So this morning, we are drawing on various disciplines to examine Boston as a model for sustainable urbanism. And I want to introduce our panel members. And I'm going to do this just in alphabetical order. To my right, Michael Dennis is a professor and co-director of the AD Urbanism Group at MIT. He has been in private practice in Boston since 1981. The firm's work has been exhibited and published nationally and internationally. In 2011, Mr. Dennis was awarded the prestigious Congress for the New Urbanism Athena Medal for his contributions to urbanism. He is an authority on the development and form of the American campus and has led campus planning initiatives at several of the country's leading universities, including the University of Virginia, Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Southern California, the Ohio State University, Texas A&M, and Middlebury College. To my immediate right, to my immediate left is Nicole Garnett. She is the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame School of Law. Her teaching and research focus on property, land use, urban development, local government law, and education policy. She is the author of numerous articles on these subjects and several books, including Ordering the City, Land Use, Policing, and Restoration of Urban America. Her most recent book, Lost Classroom, Lost Community, Catholic Schools' Importance in Urban America, which was published last year by the University of Chicago Press, represents the culmination of a major empirical research project exploring the effects of Catholic school closings on urban neighborhoods. At Notre Dame, Professor Garnett is also a fellow of the Institute for Educational Initiatives and the senior policy coordinator for the Alliance for Catholic Education, a program engaged in a wide array of efforts to strengthen and sustain K-12 Catholic education. To my far left, Dr. Richard Jackson is a pediatrician, environmental health expert, and professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at the Fielding School of Public Health at UCLA. His recent work and lectures focus on how the built environment, including architecture and urban planning, affects physical, mental, and social health. Dr. Jackson has co-authored 3 books on the built environment and health and hosted the U.S. public television series Designing Healthy Communities. In March of 2015, he received the Henry Hope Reed Award from the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture for his emphasis on the importance of traditional and sustainable urban design. Formerly, Dr. Jackson served as the director of the National Center for Environmental Health of the CDC in Atlanta, and he was the chief public health officer in the state of California. He chaired the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Environmental Health, serves on the board of the American Institute of Architects, is an honorary member of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and was recently inducted into the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, which is one of the highest honors a doctor can achieve. And to my immediate right, Samantha Salden Teach is an assistant dean of the graduate studies at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. She teaches design studio at both the undergraduate and graduate level, as well as courses in the history of urban form and sustainable design, again, at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her lectures, research, and writing focus on the understanding of sustainable environments as an intricate and interdependent web of formal, constructional, climatic, economic, and social factions. And since there is a football game here tomorrow night, she will be honored for her work in this field during tomorrow night's football game. Now, what I'd like to do is begin by offering a series of questions or opportunities for panel members to comment. And then as the discussion builds, we hope we're able to open it up for questions and answers from the floor. But I want to start with some questions to the panel. And I'm actually going to direct my first question to Michael Dennis, because we're here in Boston, and what my first question, and it's for him to start, but I welcome other members of the panel. What are the lessons we can learn, both good and bad, from this great American city, Boston?
Well, I'm not going to say what you want me to say. I think Boston is not a good urban model for the future. It's the best one we have because it's not a real American city. It's the most Western European city that we have in America, just like Miami is the most northern South American city. But despite the fact that it's the best that we have, I want to say two words about it from another lens, why it's not a good model. If you look through the good things, you will see that Boston is like most 19th century American cities in that there's a central business district, and then there are areas, basically monofunctional areas of residential outside that zone. And it rather quickly gets into single-family houses. Not in the immediate core like Back Bay and the North End and so on. But that Frederick Law Olmsted period, most American cities are made that way, from Columbus, Ohio to Notre Dame, Indiana, to Sherman, Texas, where I grew up. So it's made also of row houses, primarily of row houses. Most American cities were formed on the English model of row houses rather than apartment buildings. First apartment buildings were built in the US around 1870, and there weren't very many of them at that time. And this produces an inevitably low-density city with streets that are too wide and too much circulation. Finally, then, Boston it's the kind of hub of a regional area with hundreds of thousands of people that commute in by car every day. If you switch gears for a moment and acknowledge the facts of our ecological circumstance today, and most of my colleagues at MIT don't know this because they don't want to know it. We've now passed 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. And James Hansen used to say that if you were going to keep the increase in temperature to 2 degrees Celsius or below, you had to stay at 350. He's now revised that down. So we've passed the tipping point, and the world will continue to warm even if we were to stop all fossil fuel use immediately. And it would take 1,000 years for the Earth to get back into equilibrium again. So we're facing ominous implications about the future. and it has to do with the way we live. And we in America have contributed something like a huge percentage of the carbon into the atmosphere since 1850. We're going to have to live smaller, closer, more economically, and we're going to have to travel less if we're going to survive. And I'm not optimistic that human life will survive. In the interim, there's going to be unbelievable challenges like the immigration that you see now because of cultural conflict is going to increase due to climate change because it's going to get hotter around the middle part than it does in the northern and southern parts. So there's a whole other overlay of problems. So on that basis, I think you have to leapfrog forward and try and imagine a city that's a carbon-free, fossil fuel-free city, and it won't look like Boston. Is that enough of a rant, Dennis?
But I wonder, the issue then, or one way to say that is Boston really a model? And what's your opinion in terms of, do we look to the past for lessons?
You're foolish if you don't learn from your past, but we're going to have to invent a brand new future. When I was born, the Earth's atmosphere had 300 parts per million of CO2, and the planet had 2 billion people. When I was a young pediatrician and went into the juvenile diabetes clinic, I never saw a child with type 2 diabetes. Now the Earth doesn't have 300, it has 400 parts per million. There is a lot more energy in the atmosphere. Our oldest child was born in 1981. He has never lived in a year that had below average temperatures measured across the last 100 years. In fact, this year is the hottest year in history ever recorded, all the way through. That's the atmosphere, number one. We're dealing with 7.5 billion people on the planet, and as the ice caps of the Himalayas disappear, an awful lot of people, well, basically all of Bangladesh, lots of India and other countries are going to have to begin to move. As I look at the health of the American people, down the street, I actually kind of wanted to go to Harvard Medical School. I didn't get in. I went to UC San Francisco, which frankly was in a lot prettier city, the really westernmost European city. But you've got the finest medical center in the world sitting here, and yet we're spending about $2.5 trillion on medical care, and our average lifespan is about the same as the people in Chile who spend $1,800 per person per capita on medical care, and we in the US spend about $8,500. We're not getting very much for our money. So I never saw a child with type 2 diabetes. Now half the kids in the diabetes clinic have adult onset diabetes. And the treatment for adult onset diabetes is, type 2, is to change your diet, eat a lot more fruits and vegetables, better for the planet, better for your health, and to walk more, a whole lot more. Do we walk more? No. Most kids walked or biked to school when I was young. Now only about 1 in 7 walks or bikes to school. The average 14-year-old is 14 pounds heavier than she was a generation ago. About 12% of all of our adults in the United States, listen to this, 12% of all the adults in the United States have diabetes. Another 36% have pre-diabetes. So we're looking at half the US population with a disease that needs to be treated by walking a hell of a lot more and eating a lot more sensibly. And those are the two big treatments. Yes, you can take all these drugs, but that's the treatment for it. So architects need to be there to change the physical environment to make it easier for us to walk. In fact, let's save a lot of that suburban land and make it farms and fields that we can get food from. And thank you so much.
That raises the issue of well-being, not just environmental, but well-being. And so the concept of well-being expands the scope of the discussion beyond energy conservation to include a concern for health and welfare of urban populations. And I'm wondering, I'm going to turn to you now to ask, what are some of the indicators or elements of well-being in a community? And how can we promote that, both as architects, as lawyers, as all the disciplines that are represented here? What would you talk about in terms of that?
Well, So I'm probably not the right person to talk about well-being generally, probably Dr. Jackson is, but I mean, I think if we think about what makes a community a livable, healthy place, right, we might ask, what does the typical low, middle class person want and need from that community? And so affordable healthcare would be one example. Good schools. I was on a panel yesterday about education in Boston. A lot of great progress in education in Boston, but a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of really good public schools and charter schools and Catholic schools in Boston, but not enough kids in them. So that's really important. That's well-being. And I also think affordability of housing, which honestly Boston doesn't have. And that is another really important thing about what makes a city a livable, healthy place, is that you can live in a place that's safe, clean, near good schools, affordable health care, crime levels. A lot of my work has been on the connection between urban development and crime. So, you know, not being afraid to send your children out to play, right? So one of the reasons why kids might be walking as much is because in some neighborhoods, and including in Boston, their parents are afraid to let them go outside. And so if you're afraid to let your kids go outside to play or to walk to the park, or honestly, some of these stories that I've been reading that are just, as a lawyer, I want to scream about, you know, people calling the police because parents are letting their 10-year-old take their 8-year-old to the park. That is a serious problem. It's a serious cultural problem. It's a serious problem related to society, crime, land use patterns. I think it all goes together. So it's not, architecture and urban planning is one part of what makes a community a good community, but it's got to be a lot more integrated and holistic than to say, this is a really pretty city, and so it's really great. It is a really pretty city. I walk. So I walked all around yesterday. It's gorgeous. There's so many gorgeous buildings in the city, and if I was really rich, it would be a great place to live.
Yeah, and you know, Nicole, people fear that someone's going to snatch their child walking to school, and yet the absolute risk is no different from when we were kids. It's just the media coverage is such that people are now much more afraid of the world.
Oh, that's totally true. I'm no helicopter parent. But if I lived in Dorchester, I might not be less.
I completely agree.
I mean, it's, you know, there are places where it's, my brother-in-law is from Dorchester, is African American, and when they come to visit in South Bend, he won't let the kids like walk to Notre Dame and live a half a mile from Notre Dame, and thinking, really? I mean, our kids have been doing that all the time. So I do think community matters. The safety in community is another really important.
I wonder, from your perspective as an architect, what the elements of a sustainable city or how architecture contributes to a holistic approach.
Sure. I think the point that it has to be a holistic approach is absolutely the key. As architects, we often look at plans, whether it be buildings or whole cities, and there's kind of a joke amongst a lot of architects that gives us sort of a God complex on occasion, and recognizing that architecture, no matter how wonderful it is, building or city, isn't going to cause people to be healthier and cause people to be better human beings and so on, but it can set them up to make it a whole lot easier to be healthy. And I think that's a key that we found in a variety of issues, whether it be transportation or health issues and so on, is if it's easy for people to do, they will make the change pretty naturally. And so when we're dealing with obesity, greater public transit usage and so on, we can organize things in such a way that takes those things into account and makes it easier for them to do. To Michael's point about townhouses, you know, it is a natural something that we see all across this country in different forms, different scales. Certainly, if you're looking in Baltimore, they're a whole lot smaller than they are typically in Chicago. But the typology is something that's actually rather adaptable, and I think one of the things that hinders some folks from starting down the path of redevelopment as a community is the cost. It's a daunting thing to really tackle massive change, and one of the seeds for change has often been cities and neighborhoods that have a great stock of those mixed use and townhouse building types, because it it didn't make economic sense to tear them down, even in the hardest times. A townhouse might have been adapted to multiple apartments, used in different ways, and it became a natural point. The building was already there. We could do relatively small amounts of rehab and adaptation to create a new neighborhood as a starting point. So it does not solve, as you've highlighted, the massive housing issue in terms of affordability in this city or in a lot of places, but it is a seed that begins, is a great starting point for us.
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in is what are persuasive arguments? Because design, whether we're talking about the design of buildings and public spaces or policies for health and education and so forth, is often a very public act, and it requires the agreement and participation and support of different constituencies. So I'm just interested to hear all of you talk about what you, in your own experiences, have found to be persuasive arguments for different constituencies that you deal with.
So I think I'm a lawyer, so sometimes you architects make me nervous because
Believe me, you lawyers make us.
I know, I'm assuming you, but there's a belief that maybe if we just code this right, then we'll have great communities. So that the law itself is a change agent, and it is. I'm not saying there hasn't been incredible success with using the law to change things, but you have to. Most of what we think about as good cities, I would say, was a cultural understanding that really wasn't particularly regulated, right? And so the law, so I think that you got to get the cultural understanding right, which is why I think your question about persuasion is good, because if you get to the idea of like, well, we need to build cities differently because of climate change. We really have to come to a cultural understanding of why that is and what that looks like and what's acceptable in our culture before that's going to be a success. And so sometimes I hear people think that you can, sort of the law can get in front of the culture, and I think that's often not true. And it's often been a mistake in the past in planning when it did, right? So the law gets in front of the culture, and we, 30, 40 years later, find ourselves needing the big dig because we tore down beautiful neighborhoods. So I think that the culture has to come first, and that's why persuasion really matters.
Yeah. It's very difficult, actually. If you think back to 1850, 3 years before Haussmann began to rebuild Paris, most people were born and lived their whole lives within a few block radius of where they were born. The street was an active place. It was a space, a neighborhood center. And yes, it was dirty, and yes, the sewers were non-existent, etc. But it was a walkable people place because of a number of things. Sprung carriages among them, carriages that middle-class people could afford, began to produce movement in cities, and cities began to loosen. And people could work in one place and live in another. So all the bad principles, modernist principles of urbanism were a product of the 19th century, fundamentally. Monofunctional zoning, excessive circulation, you name it. And we are still stuck with that as a paradigm. And it's very hard to get over it. To convince people, normal people, regular people, requires a sea change of imagination. It's something that they can't imagine. You can try scaring the hell out of them, which I try to do with students, that you owe it to your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren to change the way you behave and the way you build buildings and cities. But it's a hard leap. It's really difficult. The answer is, I think, reasonably straightforward. And it's not about style, and it's not about politics and so on. It's a fundamental thing, but I have a difficult time with my colleagues over at our little technical school. So you can imagine with the general public what the problem is. But I have a faith that, in fact, if it's presented in the right way, if you have the right kinds of discussions, people are reasonable, and they do care about the future.
Yeah. Well, I think working with the community and building up the political will from the ground up is a critical factor. Working with some communities in the past for counterproposals for various developments, helping communities to identify what they actually love about their neighborhoods, the building types and so on, giving them the vocabulary, because I think sometimes professionals come in and tell them from the top down what they need, as opposed to having a conversation about really what they need and what they're experiencing, that tends to lead us astray. And we've seen that time and again over the last decades. When you have a populace that has a grasp of language is a powerful thing, to describe what they love and therefore be able to articulately rebut the various proposals for their community, that's a huge start. Additionally, along with having that vocabulary, building a new optimism that we can build good things for the future is huge. It's tragic if an entire community or our entire population doesn't believe we can do better than has come before. And it's not that we don't have anything to learn, certainly from the School of Architecture at Notre Dame. We look to the past a lot for good lessons as well as critical analysis of those that didn't go so well. But we have to believe there's something better we can do. We can't just stay stagnant. I think that's the starting from the ground up, though, is going to be a critical issue for anyone working to create a large-scale solution.
Professionally,
one of the things I teach when I teach at UCLA is that what's the most important part of your computer? Is it the hardware or the software? That's ridiculous. You have to have both. And I think the same is true, and it's what we're talking about here. Architecture in some ways creates the hardware of where we live. It's the physical structure. And the other thing when we talk about the physical structure is the built environment is social policy in concrete. If our social policy is we don't want black people in that part of our neighborhood, we put a freeway back in the 1960s to separate the folks out from there. And over again, we have created physical environments to reinforce our cultural biases and feelings. And as we go forward, we're going to have to think about how we create the built. Our policies have to be really smart to create the physical environment that's going to reflect those values. As you were thinking about the past events, the best thing that happened to San Francisco in the last quarter century was the Loma Prieta earthquake. This horrific, elevated, abandoned freeway came down, and now there's an esplanade that one can walk for literally miles, smiling the whole time, looking out on the bay. No one needs to wag your finger. The doctor doesn't say, go for a walk. You want to go for a walk. Your kids don't need to be told to run around and exercise. Yeah. They will do it. And good architecture can make people, not make them, but actually can make happiness and physical activity almost irresistible.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, so there's an idea called this sort of idea of disruptive innovation. So you're talking about different disruptions. Sometimes disruption is necessary to change culture, and sometimes with no one. I was there and it was horrifying. The Loma Prieta earthquake, my friends thought their parents were dead. It was not good, but good came out of it. In New Orleans, the school system has been completely changed because of Katrina, which was a horrible thing. But I also think maybe architects can think about disruptive innovation, which is things that we don't see coming. When I leave here to catch my flight, I'm going to get Uber, right? No one saw it coming. It's completely disruptive to the taxi cab industry. And to get early on these ideas of disruptive innovation that may change the way we think about how we should live. And I don't know what they are, honestly, I don't, but I know they're going to be there. And just to keep an eye out for those disruptive innovations, and then to allow the law and the professions to embrace them, I think is really important.
But I think also that what we're talking about here challenges some conventions of what the architectural profession is or how the architectural profession operates. And to pick up on something that you were talking about, when you give people a vocabulary to express themselves, that's a form of empowerment.
Absolutely.
But it also is something that is not cultivated in the kind of starchitecture model of professional practice.
Right.
And I want to lead that to a question about education, because many of us on this panel are educators in various disciplines. So, I guess the question is, what is the challenge to us as educators? What should we be doing or doing better or doing differently in how we educate the next generation of professionals?
Well, you put your finger on a great opportunity. I was carping earlier that the wrong people are in the audience. If you go by hair color, too big a percentage of the audience is nearing checkout time. And the tendency is to look backwards, spend most of your time looking backwards rather than forwards, about the past rather than the future. For those, and I keep looking over here with John Tittman and his group of dark-haired young people, this is in a way the answer, because things come from ideas, they come incrementally, change comes incrementally. Sometimes it's abrupt, but it comes from ideas, and the young people need to explore and have ideas about the right kinds of things, I would say, things that matter for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Some of us won't benefit from this. So education is a fundamental thing, I think.
Absolutely. I think there's a few main items. Certainly, one of my first would be instilling a sense of stewardship as an architect. That tends to be a pretty natural thing. Most of the folks that come to Notre Dame have that inbred in them from their upbringing or just the culture of our campus community. So we have it easier than a lot of folks might in that way. But in instilling a sense of stewardship, then turning on your ears and listening to the community that you're working with or the clients you're working with. It doesn't matter if it's a residence or it's a broader city plan. Getting rid of a layer of arrogance that can be built up, again, with that sort of overarching design complex that we sometimes have, being willing to engage in conversation, both with the client as well as with the other players that might have an impact on the process and better understanding of other concerns, whether that be economics, legal factors, health factors, and so on, and putting innovation into perspective. I think that a lot of architecture schools privilege innovation for innovation's sake, and innovation is not a dirty word, but we want to think about holistically what the impact of a new material, a new technology, a new form could have, and does that new form impact negatively a pedestrian on the street, or does it engage them well? Does that material make a building more or less durable? Is that technology going to impact the quality of life for the inhabitants of that structure? So I think all of those things are going to be a critical thing. And then on top of that, exposing our students more to real world folks, whether that be in business or in terms of firms or again, other material issues and so on, because we can talk a lot about ideology and about form, and those are really critical things we don't want to undermine, but we have to prepare them to engage with other issues as they go out into the professional world.
So in the law, all we do is challenge everything, all we do is just ask questions. It drives the students crazy, so there are no answers in my class, it's only questions, and so I get low ranks, I get low, clarity of content, and I say it's not my job to be clear. So I think there's two things that we can do in the law, and I think this is really important. One is just to always challenge assumptions about everything, right? So always ask why, always ask how it could be better, always ask why is it that we have single-use zoning? What was the reason that we had that? What were the social and cultural factors that led to this? Why do European cities look different? I always ask. I always shame my students, like, so how many of you want to live in a city when you after graduation? How many of you want to live in a city after you have children? Mm-hmm. And so that's shame. So anyway, the other thing I would say, though, is that I try to tell my students in the law, and I actually think that law schools do a terrible job at this, because we teach our students, our whole national law schools are geared toward everything that is national and federal is cool. Federal constitutional law, and you want to go work for the Department of Justice or clerk for a federal judge, but not the state Supreme Court. You don't want to go work in the city attorney's office. And I always try to get my students to teach local government law. I talk to my students about why sewers are so important. And it's hard to get them to get excited about sewers. But why is that you in your professional lives can get involved in making your communities good in so many ways as a lawyer. And if all you're worried about is going to work for the Federal Department of Justice, not that you can't make your community good, you're really missing a big opportunity. So I think, and they think property's boring. So I try to get my students to at least understand that planning, property law, sewers, streets, sidewalks, these things matter. And we need to just not think of them as just ambient noise. They matter, and they're shaped in an important way by the law.
You know, Samantha, both of you made me think of something I never made the connection before. The business about community, of working with community, is in fact a kind of ground-up resistance to the kind of sense of privatization that's happened over 300 years. If you look back again, see, I can look both ways, even though I'm old. If you look back 300 years, you can argue that there were good cities because there were, on a certain level, because there was hegemony of the public realm. Private life was relatively unimportant. It didn't figure. And when the U.S. was born as a nation, it was based on a balance of civic responsibility and private prerogative. Gradually, though, it's become the hegemony of the private realm rather than the public realm, to the extent that we think it's our freedom of choice to live in suburban outlying communities, and that we can do this because that oil, it's our oil underneath those other countries over there, they just don't realize it yet, doesn't cost anything. In fact, it cost $50 billion a year for the military in the Middle East before all of this stuff happened, before the Iraq War, etc. So it's not free, but it's our right. And you see it in politics, you see it every day on television. And the idea that there's a kind of community engagement that can build up a balance of civic responsibility and private prerogative, on the other hand, is really a good, I never made that connection before. Thank you.
Talk to other people. There you go.
So I spent 10 years at CDC as the head of environmental health for the United States of America. It was a hard job, but I learned a word I wasn't allowed to use in my vocabulary. I had to stricken it. That was the word accident. They actually teased us, and you paid a quarter fine if you used the word accident. And the reason you can get on a commercial aircraft in the United States and be extraordinarily confident in the safety of that flight is we aggressively did failure analysis of any time something went wrong. And it was never considered an accident. It was considered there was a failure somewhere, whether it was a pitot tube on an aircraft, something failed, and we had to look at what the upstream causes of that failure were. And it's been and we need to really approach a lot of death and disease in our country as the result of upstream failures. So when I talk at UCLA, when I teach there, I require my classes half public health students, because that's the school I teach in, and the other half come from the other schools, planning, architecture, law, business. And in the first class, I say, look, public health is about investigating the causes of death. So if you're hit by the car going by, maybe it's because it's a high-speed road, and if you're killed, it's because they're going 35 and not 20 miles an hour. And there are a whole string of upstream causes for so many of the things we look at. And so in my work, we began to really reach out to the Department of Transportation. I'll tell you, the first time I had a big shot from the Department of Transportation come to my office at CDC, and she was like number 3 at DOT, and said, we don't like building bike routes. Why? Well, we build them and nobody uses them. Well, where do they go? They go from nowhere to nowhere, and no one knows they exist. I said, well, you wouldn't do anything else and keep it a secret, and you wouldn't try and connect nowhere to nowhere any other situation. Transportation is a health issue. Food policy
is health policy. Education policy is health policy. And I'm not trying to be imperialistic and say health ought to intrude on all of this, but we should be empowering those who are doing all the other specialties with health data, with health language, with health metrics to really carry out what you want to do. And I'm going to close with one really, I think, very big point. The National Environmental Policy Act passed in the 1970s with an intention of protecting more than birds, bunnies, and Indian relics. It was also intended to protect human health. You pick up the typical environmental impact assessment, it's got 1,000 pages, and only 3 pages of it actually deal with real impacts on health. Does it destroy the, you're drilling up in the Arctic and you bring in a bunch of fast food joints, and people have been doing subsistence living for 10,000 years are suddenly being flooded with junk food. And it's awful that the birds might be affected with oil, but it's absolutely awful that a subsistence human culture is being destroyed by what we're doing. We need to think about health in a much more holistic way, which is why we need to do proper health impact assessment, or for that matter, environmental impact assessment that properly includes health.
I promised that we would open this up to some questions from the floor, so I want to take this opportunity to see if there are any questions or comments from the audience. Yes.
Thank you all for wonderful insight. I just wanted to point out that in Boston, maybe not unlike some other cities, but we have a really rich history of community development corporations, and I think that's another piece of the ground-up planning and work, because those organizations are embedded in neighborhoods, and they deal with health, they deal with employment, they deal with organizations and housing. So, and I think that Boston is special.
So I would say so she asked, her question was, so Boston has a rich history of community development corporations that have been quite successful in ground-up community organizing. And I think that's a really important point. I think that the community development corporations, the history, they're not all created equal, and that's a place, if you want to learn from the past, we can learn a lot across cities, but even within a city, about under which of these community organizations really enable the community to build social capital and try to have positive change. I think that we don't know enough, and community development corporation is just one example. We really don't know enough about what social institutions make healthy neighborhoods. So my own book about schools, when I was about Catholic schools, but when I started working on the hypothesis that Catholic schools closures would be bad for neighborhood health, I was shocked to learn that there was almost no empirical work on whether or not schools at all are good for neighborhoods or bad. I just couldn't believe that. I kept telling myself it has to be there. So there's so I think we need to know more about, not about what inside a community makes a healthy community. And we don't know enough, and not enough attention, scholarly attention, is paid to that question.
The converse of that was no one ever did an experiment of closing liquor stores to see if it was good for health. And after the riots in LA, they closed half the liquor stores in that whole area, and crime actually went down dramatically with the result of, I think Catholic schools may be good for you, certainly good for me, they were, but liquor stores probably aren't doing me any good.
Although I am reading this amazing book on the history of prohibition, and I will say that banning alcohol did not have entirely positive health effects.
No, I just think being awash in it's not good either.
I was wondering if the panelists could speak to, just getting back to Boston as a city, looking around the city, what would be the most obvious change in each of your minds that could be made to the urban form of Boston to make it more sustainable, better for public health, and so forth?
Let's start here. So I will start as a lawyer. So one question I have, Boston proper is beautiful. There's lots of great architecture. It's also very expensive. So one question I would have is, to what extent is the affordability in Boston the result of external constraints on supply? And you mentioned townhouses, not skyscrapers. So Washington, D.C. would be...
I didn't contrast townhouses to skyscrapers. No, you're a lawyer. This is an important point.
But so are there external supply constraints which are causing Boston to be not affordable that we could think about changing without giving up the fabric of what is good in Boston? So I think that would be a question I would ask. I think I'm an education wonk too, so the cap on charter schools is outrageous in my opinion, and so I would get rid of that tomorrow, and it would make it a lot better place to be a poor person in Boston if you didn't have 40,000 kids on charter school wait lists.
You need more housing in Boston. Take a walk down the street and see how many empty stores there are. And also look at the buildings, the housing buildings that are going up. It's not an argument for skyscrapers, although these happen to be tall buildings. Apartment buildings can be 5, 6 stories high and solve the problem or deal with the problem. But we need more housing. But in fact, the problem is not cities. It's not central Boston. It's now apparent that the lowest amount of carbon per capita and the lowest amount of energy use per capita and the lowest amount of waste per capita does not happen in Vermont, which is the 4th worst state for ecological issues, but it happens in cities. So the problem is not really so much how to transform Boston, but how to transform the less dense suburbs for people who drive around going from nowhere to nowhere, and for no really good reason, for actually detrimental reasons. So all of this stuff now has data. I'm not a scientist. I didn't create it. I just read about it, and it fits my argument because I like cities and I hate suburbs. And that's in essence the problem. They're transforming. They will continue to transform, and probably that's where the issues are.
I would agree that certainly suburban issues are going to be a critical item. Now, I will not claim to be as familiar in any fashion with Boston as our colleague here. I know one thing that has been a major issue in a lot of cities, and I would be curious to know if this has been an issue here, has been parking requirements for new buildings. And it has made, for instance, Chicago, a number of very traditional, very sustainable, wonderful building types illegal because the amount of parking, off-street parking that was required to go with them made it impossible to make it economically viable.
You guys, does this work? No, it's not on. Did they cut off my mic to make me stop? You young guys over there, or wherever you are, need to stop producing things from the status quo. You need to leapfrog over things and think about the way things ought to be and the way things will have to be if we're going to survive. If you apply parking regulations to Back Bay, which everybody agrees is a beautiful urban condition, you will erase it. Mm-hmm. They don't have this stuff in Manhattan. They don't have these requirements in Bordeaux, where actually, Dick, they have pretty good wine. So you need to go the other direction and eliminate parking. Why should you have a 3,000-pound monster in the city? It's nutty.
So I want to say this before the thing closes. British Columbia put in place a $5 a metric ton tax on carbon emissions. It increased by 5 Canadian dollars a year. It's now up to $30 a ton. It was predicted that British Columbia would go out of business. Nobody would want to live there. It would ruin the economy. It's now raised, I think, in the range of about $2 billion a year. Their carbon footprint has dropped close to 10% over the last 5 years, while the rest of Canada has gone up. Their economy has done just fine. The money goes back to the people. It is revenue neutral. So if you're really smart, you've now reduced your income tax, you've reduced your sales tax, but you're not driving as much. And if you build a building, it's going to be a whole lot more efficient and energy useful and long-lasting because we're incentivizing people to be smart. Capitalism works in the short term. In California, we have cap and trade. It isn't as good as a carbon tax, but it raised $2 billion this year in California, and 20% of that is going to poor communities, in particular to create housing, because I absolutely agree, it is the ultimate health issue for poor people in this country. You can't fix anything else unless somebody has a roof over their head and they're in decent, safe places to live.
I want to pick up on that, because you could look at the British Columbia experience as a success story, as a model to think about. And I want to ask what actually is a very dark question, but it hovers over all of these discussions about sustainability. When we look at the state of things, and we get the scientific descriptions of we're transgressing certain planetary boundaries, where greenhouse gas emissions are exceeding predictions in some areas, there's a very pessimistic picture there. I want to suggest that the design arts are by their very nature optimistic. To design is an act of faith in the future. And I'd be curious individually how you deal with this notion of do we have time? Is incremental change, is small-scale intervention going to be enough to spare us or to avert what the descriptions suggest is coming? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm a pessimist.
I'm with Julie and Simon. You know what that is? No. Ehrlich and Simon had a big fight about population control in the 70s. Julian Simon, now deceased, said, look, we innovate. We'll be okay. And Julian Simon's predictions turn out to be better. So I think that incrementalism is important, but I'm optimistic in the sense that I think we're pretty, as a people, we're adaptable, and we can figure this out if we recognize the need to innovate and adapt.
So 1/3 of Europe died with the Black Plague, and probably another third died of the White Plague, which was tuberculosis, which is why most of us are resistant, because we're the descendants of the survivors. The human species will get by, even if we knock off 2/3 to 4/5 of us, it will manage. The thing that gives me optimism are my students. And they don't want to live in big distant houses. They don't want to live isolated acultural lives. They want to be connected to the people they care about. They want to eat lower on the food chain and more vegetarian diets. About 10% of my students are out and out vegans. They're a pain in the neck to cook for, but they're really terrific. And I have real optimism about this coming generation and their ability to manage complex information in ways that I can't even imagine.
That's true. I'm not really a pessimist, but also I don't believe in waiting for Santa Claus. What a good friend who writes about these things calls, the term, we'll innovate our way out of this. BS. We call that waiting for Santa Claus. If you don't acknowledge the problem as a group, as a community, and work towards it with innovation that's towards a goal, it's not going to happen. And.
I would call myself an optimist. I think the incremental change is not sufficient, but by seeing real change on a small scale, people can be empowered. That goes back to the community involvement issue, and that grows exponentially, so that the incremental change doesn't have to stay at that slow pace. It grows based on that seed.
There are other questions from the... There it is. There's a microphone headed your way.
The good news in Boston is actually, I think, people love that. After a long time of ways to the suburbs. And just a comment on the parking ratio here. Boston is very strict now and has a 0.75 ratio to cars to units in residential. And if you've walked around the South End recently or here downtown, you'll see there's over, I think about, in the South End alone, there's 2,000 units going up, and 20% of every housing project is affordable. Now that doesn't mean everyone can afford to live here, but the millennials, we are hoping, who work in biotech or come to school here at MIT or at Harvard or wherever, stay here and work here in biotech. We are one of the largest
Although I went to Notre Dame and graduated in the architecture program, I love living in this city. So my real question is, a lot of constraints are usually what unite people throughout history on doing the right thing. And we haven't talked about sea level rise, which is a big issue here in Boston. I know Chicago, you probably have some concerns about it, but we certainly have concerns. And sea level rise has been what has united a lot of us most recently. So could you comment about that for climate change? Thank you.
It's ironic, isn't it? Sea level rise is caused by global warming, and global warming is caused by fossil fuels. And Boston has a parking ratio of, what was it you said, 0.75? Hello? There's a connection. If you want to help the climate, make the parking ratio 0. And if you want to help health, make the parking ratio 0. These things are connected up. It's happened within 50 years. What Dick was talking about when he was, when was it that you were little, Dick, and the parts per million were 300? It's probably 50 years ago. So it's happened in 50 years. You talk about incremental change. We're over 400. The world, we may have a culture, but it will not be the same culture, according to Bill McKibben. And I agree. It's going to keep going. It's incremental change. Well, you know, how much incremental change? It's not going to solve the problem. It's going to have to be something more immediate and catastrophic, I believe, than that.
I want to make a comment that the question about sea level rise and what that means for all of us. And I'll make this comment as an educator when I'm working with students. If you present a problem like sea level rise, that is truly a global problem, and it's a little bit overwhelming, and people in one particular discipline say, have a little bit of trouble getting some traction on how do I begin that. And I think that one of the best things to do is to take a large problem like that and begin to reframe it at a very local level and at a very discipline-specific level. So to say, okay, in this place, at this time, what can we do to address environmental issues, which range from climate change to sea level rise to toxic environments to no water now in parts of California, because it's at the local level that those problems will be manifest. When you turn on your spigot and no water comes out, that's the problem that has to be dealt with, and that goes to the top of the list of what has to be addressed.
So I just want to make a plug for the boring, because I just do think that parking matters a lot and nobody pays any attention to it because it's so boring. So I just think that that is actually an illustration of, in planning, especially in the law side, we have to pay attention to these little details that are going to make a big difference. On your point about sea level rise, I think it's one thing it's interesting to think about. We actually will probably be global warming winters in northern Indiana, because it's, you know, the winters won't be so bad. Yeah. But I think it is incremental and it's local, but that doesn't mean, so that it has to be a both and. So you can't just focus on reducing carbon emissions. We also have to think about adaptation, because the big we're not going to catch up fast enough, and the sea level rise in Boston or anywhere is a really good point. Boston dredged and filled and did all these other things to adapt this place to human habitation, but different adaptations are going to happen. And maybe that's unfortunate, but that's just real.
One last question, and then we'll...
So I'm just curious to know whether you think...
I'm curious to know whether each of you think that the incredible growth of exurbs, luxury communities, brand new, very nice high-end apartments, 5, 6, 10 stories with restaurants, etc., whether you think that's an incrementally good benefit or bad.
Can I jump in real quick? Yes. We did a fellowship in New York a couple of years ago, and I've often been accused of being in favor of gentrification, and I say, look, if one of my students graduates and she's got $100,000 in debt, starts a family, moves into a marginal neighborhood, demands that the street be cleaned up, the garbage be picked up, the parks be safe, there be better policing, and have better schools, is that gentrification? So, oh, no, that's not gentrification. Well, that's what people are calling, and people have to live somewhere, and we need to build a lot more habitation for you. By the way, I just want to say, we don't have a God-given right to live anywhere we please. If there's no water in the place, we probably shouldn't be building habitation. We shouldn't be building habitations. Nobody needs 5,000 or 10,000 square feet. We can get by on much, much less and be actually happier. You have to vacuum a lot less. It's actually happier. So, I think that as we go forward, we can build it this way. I'm just getting worked up here. Sorry.
Kathy, are you talking about suburbs or cities?
I'm talking about in the places like around Washington, D.C. and other places where they're just outside of the actual urban center. There's a very, very big, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about,
of luxury communities, right? They're no longer just luxury or not luxury apartments, but they have restaurants, movies, Target, etc. So that they're not jobs, but
there are jobs. So I guess, is it good or bad? I mean, suburbs getting denser is probably good on the whole if we assume that some people are going to keep living in suburbs because they are. So we can't just say, let's hope everyone moves to the city and doesn't leave. That's just not real. And so we have to, I think that this is one thing that the architects and the planners are doing well, is attending to making suburbs more sustainable, because those are where most Americans will continue to live for the foreseeable future. So if you can walk to the grocery store, walk to work at home, have a bike path, have a park, those things are going to matter. We can't just say, everyone should move to Boston, where there isn't enough housing for everyone, by the way, and it's too expensive. We really have to attend to suburbs and cities. So denser cities, suburbs, probably, I think, on the whole, good.
One of the things that you learn when you moderate panels like this is that a successful panel, the time is exhausted before the energy and the comments are. And this has certainly been a successful panel, but we do have to wrap this up now because we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank all of the panel members for their contributions, and I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful attention. So congratulations to everybody, and go Irish tomorrow night.
Go Irish.